Towards a safer, more inclusive military, recommendations for culture change from the Department of Defense Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault. It is a great honor for us to have this session available for you all directly from the Independent Review Commission, which I'll allow our speakers to give you a little more background and information on. They can do it much better than I can. But I just want to let you all know that we consider it a huge privilege to be able to host this session, and that all of the recommendations and discussion that's had here during this session today, this will really go to serve a strong higher policy purpose of engaging around these recommendations, of implementing these recommendations into the armed services. And we couldn't be more glad to be hosting this. So it's my great honor to now introduce our speakers. First, Kaylin Crockett, she, her, hers. Kaylin works for the Department of Defense, and Kaylin is also the special assistant to Lynn Rosenthal, who's many of you may know Lynn. Lynn was previously the White House Special Advisor on Gender-Based Violence, and now chaired the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Assault at the Department of Defense. It is really our honor to have Kaylin here joining us, and everybody, please welcome Kaylin. Our second panelist is Neil Irvin of Men Can Stop Rape. Neil has, many of you may know Neil, and they know the work of Men Can Stop Rape. I think a lot of rape crisis organizations and sexual assault programs around the country have engaged with their work in making men be a part of the solution when it comes to ending sexual violence. We're honored to have Neil here as well. Thank you, Neil. And finally, Major General retired James Johnson. Major General Johnson has for a great deal of time been in charge of the investigating and responding to sexual assault in the military. And Major General Johnson, all of the people who you are going to hear from today served on the Independent Review Commission and will be able to offer and answer a lot of questions about the recommendations that were laid out in the Independent Review Commission's report. So we are very, very pleased to have you all here with us. I think this conversation is really going to be something special. And for myself, I can just say I'm very, very pleased to be a part of it. My immediate family who've served in the military, I come from San Diego. I saw we had people from San Diego into the chat. It's a strong military community. But ending sexual violence in the military is a priority that is shared by so many people across the country. I think everybody who attended this wants to hear the recommendations, wants to hear what's happening, and hopefully you all can provide us with some answers and how we can engage. So with that, I will stop talking and I will hand it over to our panelists. Thank you very, very much. Actually, I lied. We're going to begin with a video from Lynn Rosenthal, the chair of the commission.
Hi, I'm Lynn Rosenthal, and I had the distinct honor of chairing.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Can everybody hear that? I'm going to adjust the volume a little bit.
A little low, John.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Let me actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly stop share and I'm going to make sure I have the share audio checked. Apologies, everybody. Please be patient.
The Independent Review Commission on Sexual Harassment and Assault in the Military. Hi, it's great to see everybody here today, and thank you for having this session on the Independent Review Commission on Sexual Harassment and Assault in the Military. The commission was established by Secretary Austin at the direction of President Biden, and we had a 90-day effort to look as outside independent experts at sexual assault and harassment prevention and response in the military across the services. The commission was made up of 12 highly qualified experts that came from civilian criminal justice, victim advocacy, public health, and legal programming. And this group remained independent of the Department of Defense and the services throughout our process. However, we took advantage of former members of the military We had 5 former military commanders and 2 people on our commission who had served as judge advocates in the services. We wanted, though, to take advantage of the expertise that does live within the services. And so we were supported by a large group of, a large consultative team of experts across the services in those same areas. But our deliberations were independent from the department and from the services. We were charged with looking across 4 lines of effort: accountability, prevention, climate and culture, and victim services. And we have 82 recommendations in across those lines of effort. Of course, most of the media attention has focused on our accountability line of effort and the recommendations to shift prosecution decisions out of the command structure. We said all along from the beginning that that long overdue change is not what we needed to move the needle, that sort of effort had to be nested within a prevention programming, within climate and culture, and care and support for victims. You're going to hear all about prevention today from the smartest people on our uh, independent review commission. And of course, you know Neil very well, but I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of the other highly qualified experts that you also know who sat on the IRC. And that is Indira Hennard from the DC Rape Crisis Center. We were thrilled to have her. Cindy Dyer, who used to be head of the Office on Violence Against Women, and Chris Rose, who is now the head of the Office on Victims of Crime. So many of your friends and colleagues served on this commission with us. So in addition to that accountability recommendation, and you'll hear about prevention today, we had a robust effort on climate and culture, and we made a number of recommendations to select, evaluate, and develop military leadership in these areas: surveying climates, changing the culture, and really leading in this area. In the military, as you know, it's all about leadership. And so, how we work with leaders is the critical piece of changing the culture. And then in victim care and support, I just wanted to mention that we found critical deficiencies in this area. And I was surprised to find them with all the work that's gone on over the last 10 years. But we did find that victims were not being well cared for in many circumstances, that they were being bullied and ostracized and treated badly by peers, that commanders were not stepping in, and that victims were feeling very trapped when policies were not being followed. And so we made a number of recommendations in victim care and support. And one of those I wanted to draw your attention to is that we've recommended that stronger relationships be built between the services and civilian providers and rape crisis centers. But we also know that you all could benefit from some capacity building in that regard, so that if you want to engage in that way, you have the tools to do so. And so we've recommended that the Office of Victims of Crime work with the Department of Defense to make that happen. So I wanted to just raise that so that you all can keep an eye on that if that's an area that you want to engage in. But what we're most excited about is what you'll hear about today, which is prevention, primary prevention of sexual harassment and assault in the military. And you have the best people here with you today to talk about that. Thank you.
All right. Kaylin, please send our thanks to Lynn for participating and for letting us know everything about the commission. And with that, I will turn it right over to you and to Neil and to James. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, John. And thank
Hi.
you to Meghna, Shelby, David, and the fantastic interpreters who are making this session possible today. It's great to be with all of you. Wow, 123 of you. What a fantastic group for this discussion. Goes without saying that we were so privileged to be led by Lynn in this effort. There truly could not have been a better, more visionary or big-hearted or inclusive thinker to lead this project. And so we are so glad to have been led by her, and excited that she could kick us off virtually with that video. So before we get started, we want this to be as interactive a dialogue as possible. So we're going to be moving through some preliminary slides to lay the groundwork, but we'd like to have this as a broader discussion, engaging with you, taking questions in the chat. And the first thing we'd love to do is to learn more about who's with us today. So we have a couple of polling questions that we'd love to engage with you on.
I am getting the poll up right now.
No worries.
Yeah.
And while John's pulling that up, you can see here are some of the learning objectives for our session. I won't read through all of them, but just to emphasize, we're looking forward to a robust discussion.
All
So
right.
the first question is, we'd love to know who's with us today in terms of practice area and
There we go.
yeah, thank you. Oh, wow, fast. This is really cool. It's great. We've got a good mix of folks in the sexual violence prevention and response space. Some policy advocates, some military sexual assault personnel. That's fantastic. Almost there, 77%. We don't have this as a polling question, but we would love for you to put in the chat any of you who have a military affiliation, if any of you are serving currently, have served, are serving in the capacity as a military spouse or parent, please put that in the chat. We would love to see that. And thank you for your service and for your support of our military community. All right. So this is fantastic, a really good group of folks. The second question is if you've worked with the military community before in any capacity. Great, and I can see in the chat that we have military parents, spouses, victim advocates, current service members, former, fantastic. And a good representation across the services, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps. I think I saw a Navy in there. Maybe I'm imagining that. Fantastic. Space Force and Air Force, fantastic. That's great. And we've got a pretty good balance of folks who've worked with the military and those who haven't. That's really great to see. It's a bit unusual, actually, though. There's probably some selection bias for this panel, I'm sure. Oh, wow. That's really cool, Carmel. I didn't know that they did social work, masters in military culture. That's great. Oh, very new. All right. Fantastic. Great. Okay. So fairly even split, though a little more on the not having worked side. Wonderful. And then this is the last question. If you've worked with the military community, has it been in a sexual violence prevention or response capacity? Great. All right. So there is a good segment of you who really have a lot of engagement in these issues. So really looking forward to this session with everyone. Wonderful. So we can move on to the next slide. So I won't belabor this. Lynn did a masterful job of going over the background of the commission. Just to reiterate that our 90-day sprint began on March 24th. It ended July 2nd with the release of our final report and recommendations. Those recommendations were along 4 lines of effort, as Lynn explained. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on the prevention line of effort, though, as Lynn also noted, all of the lines of effort really do intersect and reinforce one another. Next slide. This is the full spectrum of our excellent, highly qualified experts who served on the commission. You can see Neil and James on here. The prevention line of effort was also joined by Dr. Deb Howery, who is now the Deputy Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But wonderfully, Dr. Howery comes from having led the Division of Violence Prevention at the CDC. So we were really lucky to have her as well. Next slide. Perfect. So our final report contained 82 recommendations across all 4 of the lines of effort. And we have a link at the end of this slide deck to that final report, so you can dive through it if you haven't seen it already. Next slide. So just a little bit more about our approach in developing the recommendations. We met with stakeholders across the board of the military, service members currently serving, veterans, recently separated service members, commanders, service providers in victim advocacy, in prevention, outside experts in the civilian victim services realm, and really most importantly for us, we spoke with junior enlisted service members who represent the majority of the active duty force and who also represent the age population that is most impacted by sexual violence. And a large swath of those enlisted service members, junior enlisted service members, were survivors. And survivors really formed the heart of the information gathering process and the advisement for the IRC along the way. We gathered information and feedback from services through a combination of individual phone-based and in-person interviews, some virtual panels, and through an anonymous online feedback form through the SAFE helpline, which is run by RAIN for DoD. And this graphic here shows the prevailing themes from those anonymous submissions that survivors shared with us on the IRC. And I want to highlight a few of them because they have some particular implications for prevention that Neil and James and I will touch on in our discussion. So those really include the stigma for male survivors, health and well-being outcomes, the toxic climate related to gender and social norms that are harmful and create some unique military risk factors for sexual violence, and also cyber harassment, cyber abuse, and the online offline continuum of climate and culture, and the very real impacts of sexual threats and stalking and harassment that do take place in the cyber domain. Next slide. So just some quick data points to ground our discussion. Many of you are familiar with this. There is an estimated 20,000 service members who experience sexual assault every year, but a very small fraction of those survivors ever report that assault. Underreporting, as you all very well are expert in, is common in the civilian environment as well. And so that is very much the case in the military environment. Sexual harassment, which is very much in the military setting, a predictive experience in many regards of a sexual assault, is widespread. About 1/4 of service women experience sexual harassment each year, about 1/10 of men. And yet among all service members who experience sexual harassment, less than 2% ever report it. So you can see there's a huge lack of confidence in the systems. And it's also important to note that there is a disproportionate impact of sexual violence among lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members. Unfortunately, I think as many in this well-informed group are aware, given the stigma and the previous administration's ban on transgender service members, we don't have data on their experience, but we are looking forward to including through some of the IRC's recommendations, data in future years about transgender service members. Next slide. I'm going to hand this over to James to talk about really the unique risk and protective factors in the military and how that really fed into the process that Neil and James and the IRC took in developing the recommendations.
Thank you, Kaylin. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that Kaylin was an essential part of the leadership team for this IRC, and you know, the success that, if there is success with this prevention line of effort in the writing, so much of that is Kaylin and her leadership, and brings, you know, connecting so many dots for us. And so I really appreciate her leadership role in this effort. I would say, you know, as Kaylin talked about the meetings and the sessions, engagements with the survivors, all of that really, you know, response informs prevention. It's really was a really important and valuable opportunity to engage with survivors of this violence. The first thing I would say when it comes to the development of this this public health approach with the military context is that, just to shape your understanding of how we approach this effort, we met with, well, first, you know, doing all the literature reviews and reviewing the policies and the strategies that the department has, you know, been developing over these, you know, last, you know, decade, and then going out and actually accomplishing engagements at the strategic, the operational, and tactical level. And for your understanding, for those of you who don't do a lot of work with the military, the strategic level is really that 4-star level, right? The secretary of the department and his staff, the service chiefs of each of the services and their enlisted leaders and their staff, And then at the operational level, that's really down at sort of the 2 and 3 star level, right? So at the strategic levels of 4-star, operational be at 2, 3-star level, headquarters echelon, we call it, the next level down. And then the tactical level is what a lot of people think of for the military. It's at the installation level, right? The base level, where you might have colonels and below, chief or command sergeant majors, and below to our youngest service members. And so we did a lot of engagements across all the services and across all those different, what we call echelons or levels. And what we found was, just in general, that, you know, this perspective, the public health model that you see in front of you, that is common to the public health community, is not necessarily so common to the military. And so it was really, I think, for us, important to show how the military really does exist across this model, and is succeeding or not succeeding across this model, because we know that there is science behind prevention. It's a discrete field of science, and it was important for us to develop a model to show that. So if you think about in the middle of that model is the DoD, at the top of the circle is the DoD senior leaders. That would be the Secretary of Defense or the service chiefs and their enlisted leaders. At the major command and installation level, that's that next headquarters level somewhere else in the world outside of the Pentagon that exists at the 2 or 3-star level commands. And then at the unit level leaders, you're looking at kind of the colonel and maybe 1-star level leaders and their command sergeant majors, senior enlisted members at that level as well. And then the service members, which includes all individuals. And as you know it probably in the public health model, you know, that's the individual. Unit level would be the relational, and then your community level and societal level. And with a society of 2 million people plus, you know, the Secretary of Defense really is in charge of an entire society. And we looked at it with those risk, you know, thinking in terms of how do those leaders use the understanding of risk and protective factors. And so that's how we designed that. Thanks, Caleb. And I'd offer, and you know, I know I was going off there. I don't know if anything from Neil. Neil was a great partner in this. I learned a tremendous amount from Neil, but.
No, sir, you know I'm going to fill in when it's, you know I'm going to fill in. I think it's really important that, one, I want to lift up what you said about Kalen's leadership, magnificent, yeah. And we would not be where we are without Kalen's leadership on this. But I think it's really special that everyone gets to really, Kalen, you said something, unique military dynamics. And James, you know, you speak to that in such an important way. So yes, I absolutely will have voice here today, but I want to make sure that the team and our colleagues here get to learn from you, because of some questions in the chat that I think are going to be really important for some of the things that we prepare for them. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Neil. So, you know, when we looked at this, we addressed it in terms of the Secretary of Defense, I think, really characterized this well. What's working, what's not working, and what's missing? I mean, those are really the big questions to ask. And as we looked at what's working, what we really found was that at the strategic level, and to some extent at that next echelon down the operational level, that over the last several years, there's been a good realization of the need to have a comprehensive way to address not just sexual assault, but what we talk about in terms of interpersonal self-directed violence, because we know these different forms of violence are connected across a continuum of harm that starts with sexual harassment or other forms of harassment and ends with violence. And we also knew that it was important to integrate across those different domains. And at the strategic level at the Department of Defense, they have started to move in that direction with the development of, as you see on the right upper block, the Prevention Plan of Action, which is really a part of their strategic plan, which includes regulations that are focused on a comprehensive approach and integrating across these forms of violence, how they address that in a prevention way. But the Prevention Plan of Action is a really great strategic document that outlines the system and the processes that are really necessary to deliberately address prevention across the department. And so we looked at that as well. And at the service level, strategic again, this is really kind of the Pentagon level. You find that the departments, those individual services, are moving toward integrated approaches as well. And we found some services where they're integrating their approach to interpersonal self-directed violence, and then their policies and programs are all following that very deliberate approach. So that we feel is working. That's been going on in just the last few years. And I would kind of lead as we go around the clock down below that to the trauma-informed prevention. You'll see in our report that we talk about strategies, really important strategies that again are informed by response or by trauma. You'll find that we talk about a strategy to address a pilot program that would link service members to services based on understanding of adverse childhood experiences. That our service members come from all walks of life. Some of them have had sex education, some haven't. All of them have had different unique experiences in their families. And then there's the social determinants of health too, that also can kind of point the services to how can we best assist, how can this department best assist their service members with dealing with things that could result in sexual harm. And I know that Neil can probably speak really well to the credible messengers and what we found there as well.
Sure, and just to go around the clock and use your method there, to me, I think it's important on the what's working for us to really look at, this integrated violence prevention in the military, growing efforts. This was not the military culture 20 years ago. And with so much more work still to be done, we are building on efforts that have previously existed across the enterprise, which again is both hopeful and helped inform our work and why we were able to communicate and do the outreach. The prevention plan of action, a comprehensive resource of information that, as James said, really positions for more research, to learn more of what we don't know, to identify the gaps and to invest in them. Obviously, with all of our colleagues here today in this session and across the conference, always wanting to make sure that we are coming from a trauma-informed effort and place to support all of your all's great work, but also survivors to make sure that prevention starts to shape the culture. And for us at Men Can Stop Rape specifically, but on this IRC, Kaylin was so supportive of recognizing we're looking at a force that is overwhelmingly male. And we have to recognize that the science lifts this up. Most men are not doing these things. And we were really clear that in an environment where there are so many people who are action-based, action-oriented, results-driven, we were not maximizing the skill and the training necessary for these credible messengers at all the levels that James listed to be daily involved and to see this as a part of their service to their country. And so the credible messenger piece of inviting men to be involved continues to be what we've both been doing on the civilian side of our work in our community. But I really want to lift up that we came across so many people, men, women, individuals who were so committed to being messengers and credible messengers around primary prevention's role in shaping the culture and the climate. And so we're really excited about the opportunities that the IRC's recommendations will have moving forward in the implementation phase.
Thank you, Neil. And just to chime in to balance that, because absolutely agree wholeheartedly with the importance of recognizing the widespread commitment across all of the services, and really down to some of the newest recruits to being a part of the solution, wanting to be engaged, but not having the skills on how to do so, which James, I think, will go into more in a little bit. But also being realistic about the fact that, and this goes in, I think, to maybe our next slide on what's not working. There's still a lot we don't know about sexual violence perpetration. And part of that is being realistic as well about the prevalence of social and gender norms that do create that risk environment. I encourage you all to look into, in addition to the prevention segment of our report, the climate and culture segment of our report, which deals a lot with that. Some of the unique risk factors related to gender norms on this piece about male and female, binary relationships really speaks to units that have more men than women by a large degree, by a ratio of like 10-1, for example, do have higher rates of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So we have to be very real about that, while also balancing the fact that, like the civilian community, the majority of people who identify as men are not perpetrating sexual violence. So how do we bring them in to be a part of the solution? And part of that is the skill building. And that needs some work, as Neil and James will speak to further.
Yeah, I saw, and I want to keep it as kind of fluid as possible. I saw a couple of comments. One was about whether accountability was a part of the prevention, which I think it's really important that to underscore again what Kaylin said in terms of all the LOEs have overlap. And clearly, if you think at the societal level where the department operates, having weak laws is a risk factor, and so having accountability is clearly a great protective factor that we recognize. The other question was about ACEs, and was the ACEs assessment used to predict levels of trauma? And ACEs was a key component of that particular recommendation. Although the department, the services will still have to work through a lot of the details, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't want any harm to come from this individuals revealing their prior history. It's only our recommendation was focused on only providing that in a way that helps. It's that service members are assisted with whatever support they might need to be more successful in their service. And so there's a lot of details in terms of data management and all of that, and then how you connect individuals based on the assessment to the support that they need. Hopefully that answered the question.
James, I see a couple, Kaylin, I see a couple others as well that are shaping up. ACEs, is there really any prevention in the military when it's a violence of learning, protect to serve? And then recommendations in the report talks about shifting legal decisions about prosecution, but what about experiences that don't rise to the level of criminal prosecution? To me, that one was about culture and climate, and some of the leadership that we were talking about, some of the skills training, and how do you change and shape a culture. I think it's really important also, because we want to focus on prevention and primary prevention, that the role of primary prevention being what it needs to be can't answer and address both legal intervention, advocacy questions at the same time. It enhances that thinking and that culture. But I thought maybe you or Kaylin might have some more specific thinking around that culture climate piece as it related to that question, if that makes sense what I was asking.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide just sort of the technical LOE1 answer to the question about cases that don't rise to the level of a courts martial, so a criminal prosecution. I would encourage you to look at the line of accountability, line of effort 1 report, recommendation 1.2, which is about sexual harassment. Because in the military construct, there can be a fine line between what is sexual harassment and what is a chargeable sexual assault offense. If something involves touching, for example, or if it is a clear superior subordinate relationship, those are going to be cases that are going to rise to a higher level of adjudication and could be grounds for a criminal prosecution. But we know that the majority of cases, even sexual assault cases, those that are clearly a touching offense or even a penetrative offense, don't always go to courts martial for various reasons, often to do with a lack of sufficient evidence. But in those cases, it's really important, the IRC discussed, that there is a clear communication that commanders have the responsibility to really enforce among their units. Just because a case was not sent to a trial, to a courts-martial, has no bearing on whether or not a victim experienced harm. It is not communication that she or he or they were a liar. Unfortunately, going back to what Neil said about the importance of setting tone and climate and shifting that culture towards believing victims, is that right now we do have an environment when cases don't, for whatever reason, move to a prosecution. The sense among the troops is often, oh, nothing happened, she, he, they were lying. So the work of really changing that is in this primary prevention space.
Great, thank you for that, you guys. That was helpful.
So we also looked at what's not working, and I'd say what's not working and what's missing, together. As we went across all of our engagements and also looked through the reports, what we found is that to a large extent, leaders want to lead in prevention, but they don't know how. A couple of common themes. One was that if leaders knew how to lead in prevention, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And then the other one, which was that they just don't have the skills. And so when you look at reports after the fact, and we'll talk about Fort Hood, but any reports really after the fact, very often there's some sort of an indictment of the leadership, right? Leadership failure. But the problem is that you won't typically see that there's any sort of recognition that leaders were never really developed to lead in prevention. They don't have the skills to do it. And so that was a really central tenet that we learned, which was that leadership is key to prevention. Leaders they design and develop a vision for an organization. They set the tone for the culture. They control resources. And at the end of the day, leadership is really the center of gravity for the success of prevention. Clearly, other things are important as well. The next, if you're looking at the top left block, going over to the right, little is known about perpetration. What we learned was that there's not enough research, and especially research in the military context, for prevention. We don't know enough about perpetrators. We don't know enough about prevention with leaders and peers, and just in general, bystanders. There's so much that the department still doesn't know, and a lot of the research is done in stovepipes by the services. And so, our recommendation was really centered around how do you have a real deliberate research agenda that is directive and accomplishes the priorities in research that the department requires, and quite frankly, society could benefit from. And so there's, this real opportunity when you think about how little is known about perpetration. Today, the department really assumes risk every day with the amount of people that it assesses into the military, and doesn't really have any understanding of the attitudes and behaviors of these individuals who are being recruited. And so you'll see some of that in the prevention part of the report as well, in the recommendation for a compatibility assessment to better inform the department and to inform potential interventions that the department may use based on where people are with their attitudes and potential behaviors. I'd actually kind of crisscross from there to the down to the left, the services lack of prevention workforce, just to say that, although leaders require more in terms of prevention knowledge and skills, and attitudes, they also require a workforce that can support them. So when we look at this, when I learned to fly in the Air Force, I needed to learn about the weather. And that wasn't to become a meteorologist. I needed to learn about the weather because it affected my mission. You know, you need to know what's the difference between rime and clear ice, and how's that affect lift, and what's a microburst, and all these different things. But I didn't rise to the level of being a meteorologist. And that's how, you know, really this would work in the military. Is we're not trying to create behavioral scientists of leaders or sociologists, but they will require the workforce to have those specific skills in public health and behavioral health and social sciences, sociology, to support the development of strategies based on risk and protective factors where they live. And then also to be able to do the evaluation of those interventions that are employed in the strategy in a way that makes sense. Which takes you really over to Neil. I don't know if you want to talk about kind of the expectations for those evaluations and implementation of strategies.
Well, I do. Thank you for that, James. And as I'm reading, I find myself reading the comments, and again, I feel confident that when you look at the full report, we will see that what we've learned in the civilian side, on the advocacy side, on the intervention side, you know, it is really this opportunity to allow prevention to serve its role, and to have the time and the space needed to really change culture, to learn what we don't know in a military context, and to have a dedicated workforce. All of us in the civilian side, many of us who are on this call know that we are all asked to do more with less, and we're serving multiple roles, and we are having to have a caseload that is across intervention, advocacy, legal, mental health. And here we're saying to have a dedicated prevention workforce, which we currently don't have, really exacerbates the problem of accountability, of processes and systems and climate and culture. And so for us, we think it's really important on this prevention side of identifying what was not working, was really, we don't know about the perpetration in a military context. We just don't know. And in an environment that leans on the science, needs to have the outcomes that makes these decisions, we can't randomly do it. We have to really effectively know what it is we're trying to impact. And so that's where, when I've seen some of the comments, we talk about leaders' lack of knowledge, what is prevention? They don't know. And it's very similar in the civilian side. There are many of us who are doing things that we believe are prevention focused on the civilian side. It's not prevention, it would be intervention. And so I think that's the point we have to understand. I saw a question and a comment earlier that we were not working with the military. We would like to, how to do it. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit more. We have, as a civilian community, we are further down the road with what we know about perpetration, what we know about creating climates and environments around raising the awareness of sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual harassment, and how do we bring that knowledge and that resource and that capacity to our military communities? Because we did witness across the enterprise a desire, a willingness to get involved, but we also heard and saw how little they knew, how little skill, how few skills they had in prevention, and how regularly people conflated advocacy and intervention with primary prevention. And that does a disservice for where we're going. And that's why this dedicated prevention workforce will have the space, time, role, and responsibility to really research what primary prevention is capable of doing in changing culture and climate and accountability across the board. James, I hope that was the direction that you wanted me to speak to in that space, Kaylin.
I think that was great. You know, so many people conflate prevention and response, especially when you talk about education and all of that. The workforce, we found, you know, the department has worked on response for many years now, and although there's still a long way to go, there have been a lot of milestones of progress, right, in response. But when it comes to prevention, there really hasn't been the similar level of progress, and it's because for a long time people felt that the response force could do this work, and the problem is that because the response requirement was so great and so different, that it's not possible to do that, that you really do need people that are dedicated to the response requirements solely, because it's reactive, it's individually focused on a victim, it's after the fact, and prevention is really more community based, and it's proactive. It's really a different discrete science. And so that was really clearly recognized as we talked to people across all the different services at all levels, and having people with the right skill sets, the depth of knowledge, and again, these discrete sciences, behavioral sciences, is really, really important. And, the piece about a desire for quick wins, part of the challenge is also that if people don't see the results that they expect, in 6 months, they're ready to move on to some newfangled, program. And that gets back to leaders not really understanding the science. When you evaluate a program for efficacy before you implement the program, you should already know how long it may take. And it's possible, very likely, in many cases, because of the turnover in military assignments, that you won't see the results on your watch. And then you should be okay with that, because you want to evaluate, you want to implement with quality, right? There has to be this fidelity that doesn't exist today. We've seen some programs that leaders will stop doing because they just don't see the value in it, because they didn't understand the science to begin with. And so having the patience to allow these things to develop is really important. I don't know, Neil, if you wanted to talk to that too.
I was just going to say, in an environment where outcomes are so very tangible, the thought of giving spaciousness to something that might not produce an immediate outcome, like a conviction, is not the role of primary prevention. We're trying to make it so, and again, whether it be cigarette smoke or seatbelt law, we are trying to make it so normalized in all of our lives that each day we are all doing something towards primary prevention to really tangibly confront patriarchy, sexism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia. All the oppressions are working exactly the way they were designed to work. Primary prevention's role is specifically about trying, as James has said, using what we know scientifically, behaviorally, to change culture. So the thought that you would get in your car now and not buckle your seatbelt was not the case consciously 25, 30 years ago. And I remember the people who resisted, I don't want the government telling me I've got to buckle my seatbelt. So I think we've got to really be mindful in this moment that what the IRC was doing across all lines of effort was that coordinated, comprehensive look and approach. But for the prevention line of effort that James and I and Deb, Dr. Howery were on, we were trying to get further upstream so that once we got to the person that was harming other people, we're going to stop there, serve, intervene. But we want to get further left. We need to get further upstream so that we're creating a new culture where this kind of violence is unacceptable across the board at all times. And I think we have to, as a civilian community and an activist and advocate community, remember primary prevention's role is not the same as intervention or legal. It's not. It's in service of, but it has a different role, and it needs the time to establish itself, like some of those other public health issues I just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think, James, you mentioned this, and someone in the chat noted how difficult this is for the military to wrap its hands around it when sexual violence prevention and even response, quite frankly, is still seen as peripheral to the main mission or the main effort. And that's why it really does come all down to leaders, again, really understanding why taking care of our people means investing in our people as well, and providing them with the requisite practitioners, with the requisite skills to be able to advise commanders, advise leaders at every level, and leaders understanding enough in their role what they need to know to be able to create that ecosystem that is going to shore up the protective factors and reduce risk. Bella in the chat mentioned something that, Neil, you came into the IRC with a really thoughtful insight regarding about, well, how do we really grapple with this tension that the military is designed to create war fighters, right, designed to carry out acts of violence? How do we reconcile that with this mission, this need to promote violence prevention?
Yeah, I still, again, the work we do with gangs and gun violence, you will both know that I'm on an initiative here in Washington, D.C. right now. We just had an active of violence just the other day. So, violence is tangible, it's real, it's not theoretical. And I think people, at many times, as an activist, I say this, I think we forget in moments that there is a range of violence that's impacting people's lives. And so as we start the primary prevention piece, I was really clear that the job description of military personnel, when they are called to make those sacrifices, and in moments, the ultimate sacrifice, and they are here to protect and serve, we as Americans cannot ignore that as a part of who we are as a nation. We get to have these dialogues because there are people willing to protect and serve this nation's belief in freedom, equity, and justice. And so the inclusivity of that, and this conference's focus on equity, has to recognize that war fighting is indeed a part of the Department of Defense and the military personnel's job description. Now, you may never be called, as I learned, to make that sacrifice, but we cannot dismiss that as a part of real world realities. The same way we would not dismiss patriarchy and sexism are not just theoretical. They create behaviors in people's lives where harm impacts them and traumatizes them. And so it's very similar on that continuum. And as I learned from the personnel who swore to protect and serve this nation, most of them that we communicated with spoke to a humanity that felt right about how we were at times going to need to use our job descriptions in service of our nation, but at the same time recognize the violence should never be internal. That organized violence should not be, and I think it was Sasha, who is one of the, I don't know her title is which one of the judge advocates? I forget Sasha's title.
He's a lieutenant colonel, Army Reserves, and a newly minted Army judge.
And they were the ones who told us that, that is not, sexual violence is not a part of what we signed up for. And so I thought that was a really important lesson for me as a civilian to recognize it's a different job description that these people take on, and that we can't ignore that violence as a part of that job description. At the same time, we are here trying to hold people accountable for it. So thank you for reminding me of that, Caitlin, because it was a struggle for me. I'd like to have world peace, but there's others who disagree with that at times. And so I don't know what I would concede in the moment where my family was in harm's way to that. And I think it connects very much to the sexual violence, sexual harassment that we and this IRC and the DOD are looking at. So it is a challenge for us all as citizens of this country to figure out, as so many of our colleagues do every day, how to move through this correctly and to get to what right looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, at the risk of diminishing anything that Neil just said, because what he said is so powerful, I think, and really very comprehensive. I think that the services are pretty good about orienting new recruits to the mission in general that the department has, right, to potentially go off to war. There are a lot of missions that the services do, the humanitarian missions to potential conflict. And so that's important. And at the end of the day, what the military, I think, is really good, one of the many things the military is really good at is orienting individuals to what may be controlled violence. So that may be a controlled use of violence in the mission that the nation needs them to do, which is different than the kind of violence we're talking about today, right? There's a whole portfolio of things that govern the use of the lawful use of armed conflict, and the services are really good about developing that. But there are challenges, obviously, that people bring to the table every day in their service, which involves attitudes and behaviors that are in conflict with, what we would say, or that the department would say, are their core values. But so it can be a complex thing, but I think that the services are doing one of those things that's really good, is how they orient individuals to this concept of armed conflict and controlled violence. The challenge is that there's another piece of this that's missing that we've talked about here today, which is that, how do you train, or, we talked about in our sessions, how do you improve the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of individuals really through knowledge development and skill development, right? So today, as you see in that last block, that training is really outdated to a person. You know, the service members complained about the training that they had to, quite frankly, endure over and over and over again, which for some in the beginning, you know, when you're learning about response, there's so much that you really do need to understand about your role in the response environment, you know, depending on where you are in that with your responsibilities. But what we found is if they really want to move the needle, the department has to change its content, dosage, and delivery of information to develop knowledge and skills. And so when we talk about content, we're talking about using public health, basing it on public health and real world examples. That's what a lot of the service members need and quite frankly want. That's what we know will work in these situations that are called training. The other one is the dosage, front load. So, and use adult learning theory. So thinking about who gets what when. You're new in the service, you're getting something different than somebody who's been in the service for 15 or 20 years. And then thinking about the delivery, you know, using technology, leveraging technology and using small groups to increase knowledge and skills, we think was so important.
Yeah, and one piece to add to the outdated training, there was a real desire among the service members that we spoke with, especially the younger service members, to be engaged in small group discussions, to use scenario-based prevention exercises that illustrates behaviors that are unacceptable, that are on that spectrum of disrespectful to unhealthy to harmful, to be able to recognize those both in themselves and also in other people, to understand what peer advocacy looks like, to understand what bystander intervention looks like, and then to have difficult discussions among that small trusted cohort of their squadron or their unit. To really advance that learning. The other piece that we learned, which I'm sure is no surprise to all of you, especially given the young age population, is the ubiquitousness of the online environment, and that sexual violence prevention training and education and skill building has to include relationships that exist online and offline, has to acknowledge that norms can be set online and that experiences in real life and online are one and the same for today's incoming generation of service members. And so for that reason, the IRC also made several recommendations on content related to the online environment for prevention, but also the very dire need for leaders who are not of generations who were born with the internet since their beginning and grew up with internet technology and connected devices, to build a sense of digital literacy, to understand why what happens online can be so damaging, and to be able to better recognize some red flag behaviors that will need some disciplinary action.
I thought that generational piece was so key around that. It just, you know, there are senior leaders who may not be just aware of the impact of social media and that tone that gets set online. So Caitlin, thank you for highlighting that again, because that was such an important piece we kept hearing across the conversations and engagements.
Absolutely. And I think the next slide just shares some helpful misconceptions about prevention that Neil and James, you really dove into in your discussions. And I think y'all will see commonalities among, you know, civilian practitioners and those working in outside the sexual violence space, but those who are needed stakeholders to advance our collective work, some misunderstandings about prevention.
Yeah, I think it really shows the barriers, as you said, Kaylin, that are common, right, across not just the department but society. And these are the barriers that I think they're deeply rooted. Some of them are very deeply rooted, and it will really require hard work. And there's an opportunity here for kind of public-private partnerships to work on some of these really difficult societal issues. But for the department to first and foremost kind of recognize that these issues exist. Had a senior leader just the other day say, you know, I don't want to be a sociologist because they don't really understand what it means to lead in prevention. And so it just really, these really show that there are some challenges that can be deeply rooted that you know, aren't going to, you won't be able to change them with some of the surface level. They're not surface level manifestations, and they aren't really receptive to quick fixes. So.
Yeah, I just would simply support, like, to me, it was the one that stood out for me is that the military understands the problem and simply needs to take action. James has already lifted up. They really don't understand the problem. They don't understand whether it be online or in person, sexual harassment's role in creating these climates and cultures. And you could see just absolutely disconnected from that. And then the science piece, believing that there isn't a science to this. I think that's an important piece, and James has spoken to that previously. You know, these common misconceptions exist in the civilian world as well. And we've learned a lot about how to confront them. But I would just say again, the military, for all they are able to produce and all of the training education, it was clear how unaware they were of how and where the problems and the culture and the climate gets created. So I thought this was a really important piece to just highlight again.
Yeah. And I think on our next slide, and then we'll just really turn to the chat for this last 15 minutes and take the questions that we have. But James, this quote was one that I think you pulled from your conversations. If you want to talk about it a little bit, because it's a really memorable quote.
It really is, you know, and it gets back to what we talked about, conflating a response or awareness with prevention. And whether we saw fun runs or, you know, the teal pancake breakfasts or you name it, none of those really resulted in any prevention. They really were about awareness. And the challenge that I think the services have been facing for some time is that many people are already aware. And if you're 100% aware, you can't be 120% aware. You're just exhausted. And what happens when you get exhausted with the messaging is you're less receptive to then what would work. When it's time for the real prevention science to be, you know, to be planted, it's much more difficult to get people to really believe in that science. And so these kinds of things also can create barriers. So while there is a place for the awareness, you really have to have prevention science, you know, implement prevention science for prevention. So recognizing, you know, what's awareness, what's response, and what's prevention is so important.
Absolutely. John, were there any questions you and the team have been tracking for us on the chat that we haven't gotten to along the way here?
Yes, you know, there was a discussion about accountability and kind of how within the military, and you addressed this a little bit, but I think it's been pretty important in the chat. Within the military, if there's not a change in incentive, right? If people continue to prioritize their careers, or if the incentive to cover up or mishandle sexual assault remains, that the cultural change part will lag behind. Those efforts won't work. Could you speak a little bit to maybe how that can change and how we can change the incentives? I know Jan has mentioned improving leadership and bringing on additional staff and experts will help in that regard. But is there anything else we should be keeping in mind?
James, as a former commander, I think you're best equipped to lead this one.
Yeah, I know some of that exists. To what extent, I can't really speak, but I think what I've seen in this experience as well as across my career is that, the military has a lot of priorities, and military leaders are trying to juggle a lot of priorities. And the challenge has been, this hasn't really been the priority it needs to be. So when leaders say this is important, but they spend a lot of their time on other things, then it's not going to be important, right? And that's the difficulty. If you're focused on, weapon system issues or training issues that are related to things that are not in the realm of prevention, then prevention is going to take a backseat, as it has. And so when someone says, this is on my mind every day, or this is the most important thing we do, or this is key to readiness, or it's against our core values, then you need to see that in action, right? So if it's on your mind every day, how are you talking about it every day? How are you making resource decisions about it every day? How are you interacting with people in a way that shows that this is your top priority? And so I think what tends to get really in the way here is that the lack of starting with the leadership understanding of what prevention is and how it can be implemented, and then actually talking about it with service members in a way that they actually inspire. Your word was incentivize. I would say inspire them to take action in this way. So there's some low-hanging fruit. This would be for the department. If this was important, then this entire report should be required reading of every leader in the department. Should be required reading, right? You may not agree with parts of it, but you should read it, right? If it's that important, if this is your top priority, then everybody should read this report. And the other one is that the department's leaders from the very top through the services down should start talking about this in a much more tangible way. It has to go beyond saying this, we have no tolerance. It has to go beyond saying this is against our core values. And you actually need to talk about it in a way that says you understand public health and you understand behavioral science. And it's not that you have to be a behavioral scientist. Like when I go to fly, I can talk about the weather, and I'm not a meteorologist, but I can talk to you in a way that you understand that if I have certain kind of icing on my wings, I know what that means. That's what we're talking about here. And so I think those are the biggest barriers. The ones you mentioned are definitely barriers. But I think the biggest barriers are those. Is that helpful, John?
Yes, I think that's great. Thank you. There's another comment I want to draw everyone's attention to, which is around engaging with local VAs and how folks who may be working at a local rape crisis center or sexual assault program can connect and start to do work providing services to veterans and providing services to people who are serving.
James, sir, if I could, or Caitlin as well, could you also could I add the Guard to that? Because I know there's a perspective there that we've talked about and some of the unique challenges there that the local level, the Guard have that our colleagues on the civilian side could support.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I know Caitlin will have a great perspective about the VA, as we've had some representation on the IRC for that. But I would just real quickly say that both for the VA and for the Guard, what we recognized is, when you think about prevention, you really have to think about the community. And in the Guard and the VA, there's some really unique aspects to their communities. It's just one example. What we determined in the Guard's case is that you have people that aren't working full time necessarily for their military. Many of them have multiple jobs and have to maintain a level of proficiency along with that their active duty counterparts would have, but they're not full time in that unit. they're living and playing in other communities that may not be near where their unit is. And so those communities have their own unique risk and protective factors. So when you bring in a leader in that unit and the workforce that's a prevention workforce in that unit, they have to be able to understand those differences and then employ interventions that are adequate and appropriate for that. And I kind of turn to the VA piece just because I know that there are others on our IRC that were working in that, but I would say some of that applies there too. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, and I was wondering if by VA we were talking about Veterans Administration or Victim Advocates VA. Either way, I think it would be great. Neil, can you talk about, oh, we are talking about Veterans Administration. Okay, well, still, Neil, I think your perspective on the role that civilian providers and advocates can play, particularly in supporting Guard members and reservists who are off duty and spend most of their time in the civilian community. The importance of those military-civilian partnerships, and then I can add in a piece about the VA veterans admin there.
I'll just simply say I don't know a part of the country that I've been to where there's not some aspect of our military armed services. There are neighbors, our kids go to school with them, and so for me it was always about our colleagues. And I was saying this to James and Deb the whole time. You know, what do we need to do to increase DoD's capacity, and ultimately, I think that there would be a recidivism, not recidivism, there would be a reciprocal nature to if the civilian community could identify the local Guard, VA, SHARP, SARCs, whoever in your community is focused on sexual assault, and offer the training, skills, and services that we bring, the expertise that we bring as a civilian community to help increase the capacity for training and education and skill building. I think that would be a real kind of win-win for us, because we would all be, trying to do, again, more with less. We would have more. And I think that is just to be a direct outreach post the IRC and the Secretary and the President's directions behind this, that it is in the front of military personnel now. So we may have an openness that we might not have had in previous years to just be direct and do local outreach and ask what they need, how you can offer trainings and support around your all's different areas of expertise. Kaylin, I hope that captures what you wanted me to speak to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to just highlight a comment in the chat from Jessica, which is really real and important. Some of the unique challenges that survivors in the Guard or Reserves have if it's not a drill weekend, if they are not experiencing the sexual violence while they are activated, while they are, it's called Title 10 status, while they are wearing their uniform and not in the civilian setting, because there are very different reporting and confidentiality requirements and options for the military vice the civilian setting. And that's one of the reasons why we also really highlight, very frankly in the report, how important it is for military connected survivors to have options. Because of the nature of the military and the legal responsibilities that the military has to ensure the safety of its members, regardless of how well and consistently they do that or not. There are requirements to make a report that may go to law enforcement or notify a victim's chain of command if it's at a certain level of risk of harm to the service member or another person. That's challenging, and that runs counter to the ethos that we have as victim advocates in the non-military environment of victim-directed advocacy and being victim or survivor-centered. And so it's really important for civilian victim advocates to have a sense of understanding of the reporting requirements and options that exist in the military, so that if military connected survivor comes first to a civilian program, they can preserve their full set of options, whether or not to report at all. The goal, and folks working in the space to build the capacity of knowledge of military victim advocates do a really good job of emphasizing the importance of balancing survivors' concerns to report at all with safety. But being in that military environment, there are rules and policies that unfortunately sometimes those two things come into tension. And so that's why it's so important that the military not only provides in-house services for survivors, but also has these relationships with civilian service providers so that there is an option to get help from outside the gate, outside the installation, where in reality, survivors have more options when it comes to reporting. So that's something to just be aware of. I know that's not in the prevention domain, but something to be aware of. And in terms of the Veterans Administration, a couple of things. The IRC didn't focus on the VA. We did have a member of our commission, Kayla Williams, who is an assistant secretary at the Veterans Administration. So she provided some really important insights on especially that transitioning space from active duty to veteran status, as well as some of the important resources that active duty service members can access from VA centers. So I think that's getting a bit to that question. And it's great for civilian victim advocates who may be working with or serving military connected victims to be aware that active duty service members do have the ability to obtain some services from the VA. The services they're able to obtain are on a somewhat limited menu that some of the IRC's recommendations sought to expand. But nonetheless, it's definitely really good to know that if you're working with a military connected survivor who is active duty, there are some services and resources that they can definitely get at the VA. Looks like we're coming at our time here, but we want to thank all of you. And James and Neil, I want to give you all the last word here. This slide, this quote from our Secretary of Defense, Austin, really is just meant to reinforce much of what James and Neil said about why leaders are important and why we think this moment, and we're hopeful that this moment is actually a very different one and an opportunity.
James, I'll go real quick so you can round us out, sir.
Sure.
I just want to thank all of you all of our participants today for all the great work you do in community, all the service and advocacy that you provide. This is, we confront violence as a way of life in service to others. So I'm always humbled and thankful that I can support, hopefully, your thinking and look at these challenges. Obviously, to both James and Kaylin, continue just to support their leadership and their great work. And then John, you and your team, all the interpreters, Shelby, thank you all for everything that you've done, and to Valor US and PCAR and all the other conveners. We will always be here as an ally for you all. It is difficult work that we do. And so I'm just thankful that I get to do it with such amazing people, and I'm just truly honored, and thank you. James, I'll turn it to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks to you and Deb for the work that we were able to accomplish together. And Kaylin for all that you really tied so much together across the entire IRC supporting Lynn's leadership. I would just, real quickly say that I think this slide is a really important way to end because, and to Kaylin's point, this is a really important moment, right? The administration, the department are all focused in a way that I think is really powerful and could really lead to the change that I think so many of us want, right? And we hope that this report is a tool in their kit to get there. But I'm really hopeful based on the things that we've heard from the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and so many people across the entire enterprise that we're able to engage with. This moment, I believe, is a real inflection point for our nation and especially for the department. And so I was just really proud to be able to serve with the leaders here on this call. And John, thanks to you and the team at Valor to all that you did to support this, because I think it's so important. And for all of you that have tuned in, thanks for what you're doing every single day in this prevention effort. So thank you.
Thank you all, and such a tremendous thank you to our panelists. And I want to again acknowledge all of those who attended, who have served in the military, or had family or spouses who have served. We're so grateful for your service and for you engaging in this conversation and what is really a difficult issue. And we're all committed to ending sexual assault in the military. Thank you all so much. That actually concludes not just this session, but concludes the National Sexual Assault Conference in 2021. We're so pleased to wrap up this way. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.